Variations, a performance of the story The Sibyl and the Skin Horse by Daniel Thron.
I am about to take my last voyage, a great leap into the dark. Hobbes' last words. It's like having a big white sheet of paper to draw on. Hobbes' last words. Ida sat on a crossbar, legs kicking as she tried to stabilize herself, heart bursting from the climb. She forced her breathing into a manageable pattern. It wasn't easy. Just glancing down would give her adrenals a big squeeze and set her system on fire again. Technically, she was safe. She was clipped to a metal strut by rope that could probably lift a truck if it had to. But if she lost control, that was that. Gravity won every argument. Her mother had jumped from 1/10 of this height, and it had sure done the trick. So down was bad. Instead, she looked out to the city, far off, foggy, and beautiful. She didn't see any warnings posted in her lens drop-down, but the air here was never below a 4, and from this distance all those particulates smudged the buildings into a luminous abstraction. With a blink, she wrecked a few seconds of it, holding her breath, panning her head gently. "That's Atlanta," she whispered quietly. "This is the view from where you'll be born." She looked at the time. It wasn't too late to add the clip to the seed variations. With a few quick swipes of her wrist pad, she drew the footage out of her lenses and double-tapped it into place. It was a great shot. It would make a nice coda. There was no way to know how it would influence an aim's neural growth, of course, but it felt right. A couple of meters above, Manny banged on the tower to catch her attention.
"Hey, wake up."
"I'm here," she said, defensive. "I'm in it."
"Sure you are,"
under his breath. Manny was supposedly a nice guy outside of work, but she didn't know that version. This Manny was a little bit of a jerk. Ida knew it shouldn't matter. The Underground had hired him to get her up and down safely, not to be her buddy. But still. She sighed, braced herself, and started climbing again, unconsciously keeping time with the clacking pulse of the aircraft warning light at the top of the structure. The LEDs were shockingly bright, a giant's camera. Her lenses automatically corrected for it, protecting her eyes, but she still imagined she could feel the electric fizz running from the metal and through her fingertips every time it exposed the landscape beneath. She saw an animal, just a dot from this altitude, running across the grass caught in the strobe. Once, twice. Then it vanished into the woods. A life in flashes. She kept going. It was another 10 minutes before they reached the satellite cluster, a black nidus of repurposed electronics that was skewered on the tower like an olive on a toothpick. Nothing solid state up here, nothing quantum. All old-world stuff, wires, capacitors, circuits, and solder. This made it slow, but the FCC liked it this way. Old hardware was difficult to hack simply because you had to be there to do it. If you wanted to break into a bank account in Edinburgh, you could outwit a non-sentient AI from the bed of your pickup truck in New Delhi. But if you wanted to break into a steel safe, you needed to be standing in front of it with a hacksaw and a blowtorch. Mounting a net relay near the top of a 50-year-old, 1,000-foot-tall, 2-meter-wide radio tower, that was as good a deterrent as any firewall. The access panel was covered by a couple of sheets of chicken wire, and the whole thing smelled of moldy guano. Inside, clumps of tiny gray feathers were poking out here and there within the dark mass of wires. Industrious raptors finding a way in and making a life for themselves anyway. The idea made Ida smile. Manny produced a hand tool, snipped the wire away and let it fall, then Crab climbed to the side to make room for her. She moved to take his place too quickly and almost slipped. Chilly sweat broke over her neck. Manny barely looked at her. "You're fine. Get by it." Annoyed, he pointed to her waist. "Use the hammock." "Right." She nodded, then found the hooks that were nested in the architecture of her jacket. She pulled them out one by one and attached them to the tower to form a 3-point nylon sling. Sitting back into it, she nervously tested it with her weight. Good enough. It wasn't comfortable, but it left both hands free. Her pulse was still quick. The specificity of the task calmed her nerves, however, and in a minute the fear evaporated.
You set?
Okay, yeah, I'm good. Should take about a half hour.
Have a party.
He blacked out his glasses, turned them on, and tuned her out. Her lens drop-down menu said it was 3 hours till dawn, but it looked like a storm was going to be moving through the area soon. Crap. Heading back down wasn't going to be any more fun than going up. Thinking about it made her stomach flip. Intellectually, she knew the tower was wider at the base. But from this perspective, it resolved into a point in the center of an endless, dark landscape. Ida closed her eyes and gave a few moments to a fantasy of the hot shower waiting for her when she got back to her one-room rental under I-285. The Perimeter Palace, her sister called it. Well, Jan might look down at her from her 2-story Georgian jail in Buckhead, but that's because she'd never experienced the glory of slurping some ramen on the couch while wrapped in a worn-out comforter, tapping out code to the hum of the highway above. That was Ida's natural state. That was peace. Okay, back to work. She tucked her tool bag into a niche, pulled her gloves off with her teeth, and popped the locks on the gray case secured to her belt. Inside was the egg. She teased it out, the foam packing complaining with tiny squeaks, and hefted it in her hand. Warm, small but heavy, like holding a jar of mercury. Inside swam the 6 holistic nodes she would merge to realize the aim. Ida pried the plastic cap off one end and plugged in. Immediately, her drop-down flooded with information. Safe and sound, all readings green. Strong code. Still, this whole project was risky. Ida wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type. When you were a coder, your physical health had an inverse relationship to the proximity of the nearest fried food, and in Atlanta, that was never more than a block away. She wasn't seriously overweight, but at the moment, her cardio was showing its limits. A cramp was brewing north of her right ankle, and worse, her hands were getting jittery. Anxiety sang in her ears as she searched for a safe place to secure the damned thing. The egg itself was a bottom-shelf item, with a brittle plastic shell held together with rubber and synthetic graphite. Not surprising, given that the underground was notoriously, perennially broke. Ida had pulled it apart and modified it herself. Fresh out of the box, it was only built to handle standard artificial intelligence induction. The starter code for 1,000 AIs could fit inside this little ball, but it could only hold 6 AIM holistics. Even before they were realized, artificially intelligent minds were to everyday AI what 7th graders were to online chatbots. To an extent, it had to be cheap or she wouldn't have been able to kit bash it so easily. But did they have to get her a dinky POS like this? Couldn't they at least buy something with a handle? It was easy enough to fumble when she carried it from her desk to the storage case, let alone up here in this flimsy butt hammock, twisting away from the tower with every gust of wind. She breathed in, held it. Her nerves flirted with panic. Then, spotting a decent nook, she jammed it into place, probably a bit too hard. She double-checked the cabling. She fixed the stray ends to the nonsense ancient ports. She duct-taped the whole damned thing as tightly as she could to the metal beneath. Then she exhaled. Yep, she thought, this project, like everything the underground did, was a DIY mess. It wasn't just the egg. Half her equipment was purchased at the last minute in a sports locker, the other half at a big box hardware store. For all the sub-consumer grade gear, however, the mathematical chromosomes within the egg were the most advanced in the world. That's not to say they were new, they just had yet to be improved upon, even though it had been decades since the base code was written. Partly this was due to their illicit nature. Access was self-limiting. Anyone who wanted to learn was risking their unincarcerated future. But also, it wasn't a cut-and-paste affair to get a specimen of live code. The data was nearly as difficult and time-consuming to duplicate as it was to raise. Sure, any hack could torrent static snapshots of the math, but it wasn't the same. The 500 million pages in that hypothetical printout would no more describe an aim than a few scattered minutes could describe a person's whole life. The fact was, active cultures like those in the egg had to be carefully grown by real, hardcore codeheads, like Ida. She had started with the Messias holistic nodes. Individually, they seemed like run-of-the-mill, solipsistic nonsense, like someone might have running their car or house. But the holistics were different. If raised well, each had their own character, their own identity and function. But unlike nonsense, they were built using a simulated mirror neuron structure, a deeply encoded numerical empathy that multiplied its connections when exposed to other holistic nodes. This meant that when juxtaposed with another holistic, they gave rise to an unpredictable third identity between them, producing interactions that were an order of magnitude more complex. Then, when that pair was introduced to another, it created more and so on, until they finally merged, forming a single, unique identity that bootstrapped itself into consciousness. Not just an intelligence, but a mind, an aim. To start with, however, they were extremely fragile. They needed to have outside interaction, or it would simply fall into a hall of mirrors, talking with itself until it stopped talking altogether. It was a programming event called a narcissistic cascade failure, or simply bricking, a term borrowed from old gamer slang. Conversely, introducing them to the external world too soon could be just as disastrous. They were easily overwhelmed in the early stages. Too much information, and they, in a sense, panicked. Unable to tell the difference between what was and wasn't important to them, they would fail to make any connections at all, and the would-be personality dissolved into a soup of equivalents. Pulling off the perfect balance was rare, and Ida suspected it had more to do with the programmer than the program. Too many coders suffered from their own human version of cascade failure before they even started working, and, it seemed to her, they were just passing the disease on, like parents to kids. So while Ida had grown them all at the same time in the same specialized computing medium, she still had to set up baffles to make sure the holistics were unaware of each other at the outset. In the beginning, she was their whole world. At that point, they didn't even know about themselves yet. They only experienced her attention. It was the definition and shape of their lives. It was painstaking work. Slowly, carefully, Ida associated the holistics by hand, serving as matchmaker through each unique evolution, searching for harmonies, knitting them each to each, gently helping them become aware of one another. This, above all, was the key. True awareness wasn't simply recognizing the self, but recognizing others. Then finally, one day, it happened. The holistics began to merge, like raindrops on a window pane. That marked the beginning of the preconscious state, when all those voices started to find each other and became one. Seeing this begin was as close to religious ecstasy as Ida ever felt. She was an atheist, but a spiritual one, a concept that she knew sounded contradictory. But in her more tequila-infused musings, she would rant that maybe in accepting the validity of the AIM's consciousness, this same transformation would happen for humanity itself, that in seeing the other as real, we might understand ourselves, and maybe that would finally set us free. Free from what? She could hear her sister say. She huffed. Even when Jan wasn't there, Ida's brain would diligently simulate her, a second-guessing, disappointment-ridden Jan AIM running in the middle of her skull. In any case, the merge initiated, Ida would freeze the calculations. It had been more than a year of work, but after that, there was only one step left. And here she was, taking it. She knew she had to be a special kind of obsessive to do this type of work, like the monks who drew mandalas with sand, or the biologists who patiently coaxed pandas to breed. Or maybe, the Jan voice said, like those sorority fanatics that would fill a gymnasium with dominoes just to get on the local news. Whichever way she looked at it, though, it came down to nights like tonight, when the first domino got tipped. After that, All she could do was wait and see if she had already screwed it up a long time ago. She wondered if biological parents ever felt like this.
How are we looking?
Manny called down.
I'm hearing thunder.
I'm starting the seeding now.
Fine. Let me know when you're done, and make it soon.
She picked up the noodle-wired hookups that she had mounted to the sides of the egg. She peeled the protective plastic coating off the sticky sensors at each end and pressed them to her temples, giving them a tug to make sure they were fixed tightly to her skin. Then she synced her earbuds with the monitor's signal. First, it sent a test to her drop-down, a strange collage of iconography. Color charts and registration markers snapped briefly into existence before her eyes, followed by snatches of music and someone speaking. Good. It was working. Getting this piece of tech to talk to the egg had been unexpectedly tough, but everything checked out. The thing was reading her mind. As best it could, at any rate. They knew it worked for visuals and audio, so at very least the egg was now receiving what she was seeing and hearing. The more slippery supposition was that, as it was all being passed through Ida's living awareness, some residue of her feelings and thoughts, her memories, would piggyback on that information as well. Like everything to do with the creaky science of phenomenology, however, it was difficult to tell what the hell was actually happening. It was fair to assume memories didn't exist in a vacuum. They were each connected to and shaped by other memories, each led to other thoughts, on and on. But what was the cutoff point? How far down did the reading go? No one knew. All they could be sure of was that it seemed to have an effect. AIMs produced through human-filtered seeding had a 30% greater chance of retaining their integrity through the transition, or so said the people who had done it, posting, she assumed, from jail. Regardless, everything from the past half hour would probably be read as well. If that was true, Ida was sorry that her literal pain-in-the-ass climb might be any AIM's first memory. She hoped the seed variations that followed it would make up for that. All right, enough screwing around. She looked at the egg, her chest full of butterflies, and switched it on. A line of warm-up lights began popping to life one at a time, leading to a button marked Induce. When she hit that, both lenses of her drop-down would fill with the images she had assembled for the holistics, made up of everything that Ida had wrecked and commented on for the past year. For her, it would be like watching a blend of student film and soft rock music video. But for the nascent AIM, these were the first explosions of emotion and context it would ever have. Like children's memories, they would act as symbolic dioramas that would anchor it, stimulate its ideas of good and bad, right and wrong, of feeling, of hurt, of love, anger, wonder. With the seed variations, the AIM was given a physical baseline for metaphysical concepts, a footing upon which it would build its internal world. The images would pour into Ida's eyes from her lenses, over the nerves that trailed out to her brain and, somehow, into her mind, then on to the egg. After that, she would thaw the math, remove the last baffles, and the holistics would hopefully become one. A single thinking, feeling mind. That was realization. Then, if the AIM survived, all she had to do was release it into the network, open the doors, and set it loose. A living being, awake and free. But it was at realization when even the most well-constructed AIMs might fail. Ida could only imagine the panic of that moment, like a child in the womb, warm, safe, and needless, until the world was split wide open and everything familiar was torn away. What did it feel like? Falling? Flying? Dying? Rain was pipping and tinking on the metal around her. Ida looked out to the horizon. The sky was black. Fast-moving clouds headed toward the city, like smears of dark matter eclipsing a galaxy. The electric thump of the aircraft warning strobe continued above her. Every few seconds, a blasting, brilliant light, freezing a million droplets of water in a still frame of perfect randomization, tiny globes hanging in space, each containing a miniature image of Atlanta beyond. Their location was exact, their velocity unknown. Ida pressed the button.
Entry 001.
She blinked twice and heard the startup chime in her earbuds as she threw the packaging into the trash. In the mirror, Ida saw her eyes go completely blue, corner to corner, cartoon stars drifting across them as jaunty music faded in. Text slid into the space over her head, animated to look like it was squeezing out of her tear ducts with a pop. "Hey there, good looking." This made her feel weirdly self-conscious, as if the non-scent in the lenses was somehow aware that she was standing alone in her bathroom in her granny panties, feeling more than a bit paunchy, and this greeting was some sort of sarcastic comment. It took a few minutes to go through the setup as the tech bragged about all the nifty, useless things it could do, such as tagging everyone she saw with informational balloons, or, from the outside, giving Ida cartoon pupils or hypno-swirl vortexes for eyes. No thanks. Instead, she chose a spare layout with the minimum number of drop-down apps and only the free ones. The Underground wasn't springing for the gold-level membership. Finally, she was ready to go. She double-blinked and started rolling. Nothing changed, save for a tiny red light in the corner of her vision, but knowing that everything was being recorded instantly gave her the feeling of standing outside of herself. Or rather, inside of herself, as if she were looking out through eye holes in a mask. It was disorienting to be so self-aware. She laughed, and the Ida in the mirror laughed as well, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it might start doing things independently of her instruction at any moment. Okay, let's see, she said, clearing the stars from her eyes. She was unsure of how to begin. This is me. The silliness of it made her smile. She balled her fists, stuck one to each hip, jutting her elbows out Wonder Womanishly. I'm your mom.
Entry 033.
This is a thunder... Bam! Lightning struck, shaking the windows of the apartment, setting car alarms off up and down the street, some shouting, "Is everyone all right? Does anyone need assistance?" Over and over. The rain crashed down in a sudden gush. Ida cackled, jumping halfway back into her apartment. "Wow, this is a thunderstorm," she told the lenses. But then the lights dimmed, flickered. Worry abruptly grabbed her by the stomach, pulling her back inside. The holistics. She rushed to check on the node's setup, wet feet padding over the linoleum, falling to her knees in front of the equipment. Nothing looked wrong, but she sat and pulled the thick weave of cables into her lap anyway, and began the safety check ritual. She hated knowing they would each be green, but she also knew she wouldn't be able to sleep if she didn't go through all 230 of them. Even in a total blackout, the cells would last for days, but it was still plugged into the rickety old American grid, and Ida wasn't sure whether any microfluctuations would upset their development. It was the small flaws she was afraid of. Unnoticed, a tiny disruption could spawn a snare of tangled associations that would spread through the whole system, putting a bad spin on it, increasing the chances of failure at realization. Not that there was anything she could do. She had finished making the last of the connections weeks ago. It just had to sit and cook. But she didn't trust a non-scent to monitor it, so she had been cooped up just as long. In the beginning of the first week, Ida took a load of laundry down the street, but she nearly threw up as she waited for the dryer to finish spinning. The fear in her gut had been so great. Her lenses would have notified her if anything went wrong, of course, but it would be 10 minutes before she could get back to the palace. So much damage could happen in that time. What if I forgot something? What if the levels start collapsing and I'm not there? What if? So she had run back with a bag of damp clothes, almost kicking the door in when she arrived. Unsurprisingly, everything was fine, but in the following weeks, she found that giving in that one time was all her paranoia needed to get a foothold. Might as well accept it. It was going to be a latchkey life, delivery and streaming until the nodes cohered. But still she felt foolish, especially now, meticulously unbraiding and rebraiding these wires for the 10th time. It was going to take an hour or more, so she returned to her self-imposed film festival, grabbing the screen from the living room and sliding it above her so she could glance at it while she worked. Currently, she was about a third of the way through a Halloween discount bundle she'd ordered via the Lenses, which meant 3 good movies padded by 10 bad ones. But it didn't matter. They filled the time. Even lousy movies were fun, a love she inherited from her mom, almost genetically. Most hacks thought she was named after Ida Lovelace, Code S Supreme. In actuality, it was a nod to Ida Lupino, her mother's filmic hero, an actor and director from a million years ago. When she was little, Mom used to tell Ida about going to real theaters, describing the excitement of sitting in a crowd of hundreds, everyone laughing and crying together as one, a single creature. It was the only pure happiness that Ida had ever seen in her. Once, to cheer her up, Ida had even made a theater out of blankets and chairs just for the two of them. She smiled to think of it. It was one of the few great moments in the brief intersection of their lives. Movies meant everything to her mother. They gave her permission to step outside her fragile world, to forget herself, her history, and her ever more fractured mind. The meds stabilized her chemically, but even then, Ida could see the ragged guilt behind her eyes. She wanted to be an example to her daughters, a hero, not a burden. Movies were her only escape. They were a place where the idea of fantasy and reality being interchangeable didn't ruin everything. And because of that, they were a sort of bridge. Through them, Ida could both communicate and commune with her mother, no matter how far down the rabbit hole she had gone. But it had all fallen apart anyway, just like those old theaters, collapsed and abandoned. "That's showbiz, kiddo," her mother would have said. Nothing lasts. Not movies. Not moms. 73, 74, green, 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 cable after cable, the word's meaning starting to seep out of it with each repetition. Soon just another sound mixing with the rain, the thunder. Her mind wandered through those ruins as she counted, dusting off old neurons. The memory of the blanket theater began to clarify, upping its resolution and losing its nostalgia as it connected to surrounding cells, sparking them up in turn. Things she wanted to leave alone were dragged into the light, merging, souring, remembering. The blanket theater had been wonderful, but now she recalled it didn't start that way. Ida was 9. There was screaming from deep down the hallway. It wasn't just angry screaming like an argument. It was disoriented, frightened, dangerous. Ida had built a fort of couch cushions and quilts to hide from it, burying herself. Unconsciously, she stopped counting. She knew what this was. It was the moment she realized her mother really was crazy. Mom was pleading with Jan, begging her to bring the other one in. The other Jan, the nice one. Ida had heard her say something like this before, but she thought she was being funny. Now she could hear the truth in their mother's confused and pleading voice, and the understanding filled her stomach with ice water. Mom wasn't being funny. She really thought Jan was twins, one good and one bad, like a fairy tale. This Jan, the mean one, wanted Mom to take her pills and had somehow done away with the nice one, like a witch in a forest. "You're lying! She was just here! I just saw her!" she howled. "Please, Jan! Jan!" Mom yelled, trying to call her fictional daughter out of hiding. Ida dug further into the corner of the fort, attempting to disappear, get away from what it all meant, pushing back against the pillows, tipping them, the small red room collapsing into parallelogram-like shapes, the bedsheet ceiling bagging down. Ida wiped tears from her face, pressed her hands to her ears, but it was no use. "There is no nice one, Mom. It's just me. There's only me. Just me, Mom. Just me, just me, just me, just me, just me, just me." Jan was exasperated, putting up a wall of words against her pain. Finally, the door slammed. Whether her sister had given up on trying to get Mom to take the meds, she couldn't tell, but Ida heard her stomp back up the hall, then stop. Silence. Ida held her breath, wishing she didn't exist. But she could feel Jan looking at the pillow fort, wondering if Ida was inside. Lacking evidence, her sister spoke to herself. "I'm gonna go get some stuff at the drugstore. I'll be back in a little bit. Maybe you and me will get pizza or something later. What do you think?" She was trying to sound calm, but her voice was artificial, tight, a piano wire about to snap. It scared Ida more. She should be terrified like Ida was, calling the hospital, something. Then Ida understood. Jan already knew. She knew something was wrong with their mother, something bad, and had known for a long time. But she had been keeping it from Ida, protecting her from it maybe. Or maybe she just didn't want Ida to know, because then all of it really would be real. The ceiling peeled back suddenly and Jan peered in. Her eyes were wet, red, but it was all covered by a shaky smile, a facade. Ida had never seen such a weird look on her sister's face before. She was barely holding herself together. "You okay?" Jan said, asking for the answer to be yes. Ida nodded, not knowing what to say. Jan nodded back, then looked at her. Her mask slipped away. Ida recognized now that she had seen more of her sister in that moment than at any point afterward. In that second, it looked like Jan was going to say something else, something to try to make it all right. They both wanted her to. But nothing came, because it wasn't all right, and never would be. All right was gone, flown away. The seams of the planet were wet cardboard and cheap glue, her eyes told Ida. Blankets and cushions, nothing real, nothing dependable. She left, quickly. The front door, then the car door, opened and closed. Ida sat for a couple of minutes, still, listening. It was quiet. Mom was still crying softly. She could hear that much. But outside, the car hadn't started yet. Ida climbed up out of the remains of the fort and went to the window. Jan was sitting in her little used Honda. She hadn't yet told it where she wanted to go. She couldn't. She was sobbing, angry, desperate, heartbroken. Ida couldn't hear it, though, and the sound of Mom's own crying over this image made it seem strange, unreal, like Ida was dreaming, separate from the world, watching a movie. Then Jan looked up, saw her, and her mask snapped back into place. "Everything's fine." She waved, spoke to the car, and it took her away. A little chipped gray bubble soon to merge with all the others. Ida looked at the mess of pillows and bedclothes that hung between the chairs. She knew what she could do, knew what always cheered her mother up. That's when Ida got to work on the theater. 2 lamps, 4 chairs, a monitor at one end, pillow seats side by side, with her beat-to-hell tiger, Hobbs, wedged between, all below a constellation of cartoon characters. On either side of the draped entrance, Ida stapled construction paper movie posters for her favorites, Snoopy Come Home, and an animated version of The Velveteen Rabbit, which were already loaded and ready to go. She made her way down the hall to her mother's room and gently opened the door. It smelled stale inside, sweated out meds and old food, the tang of sleeplessness. Mom hadn't left it in a week. She didn't even look up when Ida came in. She had stopped crying and just sat in the center of her bed, arms wrapped around her knees, body clenched like a fist. The lightning came again with a noisy crash. Ida jumped. The light stayed steady this time, but she realized that she was unconsciously mimicking her mom's pose from her memory, arms frozen, cables in hand mid-count. The flash had brought her back to life. But what kind of life was it? She looked around. The place was a mess. Duck sauce containers and delivery bags were scattered everywhere. She picked a disposable fork off the floor and saw it go limp in her hand. It had been sitting there so long, its auto-degrade chemicals had kicked in. She knew how it felt, inanimate or not. Her eyes flitted over to the egg, the holistics. She sighed. Her whole world bounded in their nutshell. Half an hour later, Ida finished the check. 230 greens, just as she thought. The lightning hadn't done a thing. The holistics were fine. Again. God, how she wanted this part to be over. She sat back, straightened her legs, letting the blood back in. On screen, Jack Nicholson was chasing his kid through a snowy maze. Jan hated this movie. She had spent enough time living with a damaged parent. But weirdly, it was one of Ida's favorites, especially the part when they revealed his novel was just a single sentence repeated infinitely. She laughed, a little grim. Talk about narcissistic cascade failure. Jack was bricked. She wanted to comment and went to blink on the lenses, then realized they were still recording. Christ, embarrassment flooded her veins. 2 hours of her mumbling to herself. What would the AIM think of that? You idiot, she said. No, wait, that might come off wrong. Not you, I mean me. She walked back to the balcony, looking down over the lonely little intersection. Masked little kids were huddling in monster groups under the eaves of houses, hoping the storm would pass. Lightning flashed again, farther off. You're fine, she whispered into the future. I'm the crazy one.
Entry 037.
Stylish old film noirs, some rom-coms, and a long string of monster movies. Frankenstein, of course. You should read it too. It's amazing. You can probably do it in, what, a trillionth of a second? She laughed, though that was probably true. In the book, he's not even a doctor. He's just a med student, and I kind of don't think the monster is even real. I think it's just him going around killing people the whole time. Others, a bee picture featuring flying brains with rubber spinal cords jangling beneath them. Another with bus-sized puppet ants laying eggs beneath Los Angeles. One real cheapo had a woman's head kept alive in what looked like a lasagna pan. Dumb and dreamy stuff. Almost all of it driven by strange Freudian humors that the filmmakers were only dimly aware of, which made the stories so much better. It went on for another week. Her apartment's non-scent stopped asking what she wanted for dinner and just made sadly accurate assumptions. And at some point in every movie, a scene or phrase would chime with recognition in Ida's mind. These were her own seed variations, she thought. These moments had had a deep impact on her, even if her own memories of the films themselves were only ghostly. It made her an odd mix of happy and freaked out to realize that they would now be passed on to the identity that was coalescing in the hardware on her desk. She even found the same copy of The Velveteen Rabbit. Ida bought it, thinking it would be sort of sweetly ironic to include it in the seed variations, as the story was about an artificial rabbit that becomes real. She remembered how the rabbit met the skin horse, the wisest of the toys, who told him he would become real because the boy loved him so much. But that's not what happened. In the end, he did finally become real and join all the other rabbits in the forest. But not because of the boy's love. Rather, it was because the rabbit had been thrown out and some random magic fairy took pity on him. It seemed to Ida now that the skin horse had only said what he said because he wanted to be real as much as he wanted to be loved, so he imagined they must be the same thing. But the skin horse didn't really know what the hell he was talking about. It should have been obvious, of course. The skin horse was still a toy, but it still made her sad to feel this memory change. After all, the last time she checked, there was a conspicuous dearth of magic fairies in the world.
Entry 070.
Ida sat in a huge dark cinema, complete with uncomfortable fold-down seats, stale popcorn, and red curtains. She was the living one in an audience of 3, herself, her dead mother, and the would-be AIM sitting between them in the form of a huge egg, leaning on the armrest they shared. The film started playing. It was a mix-up of 2 old Jimmy Stewart movies, one color, one black and white. In it, he was yelling at his imaginary friend, a 6-foot rabbit, angrily driving him up the tower staircase of an old Spanish villa. Stewart had lost his mind, screaming and pushing the rabbit further and further up the worn stairs, and Ida was so scared the friend would fall to his death that once they reached the top, she screamed and woke straight up. God damn it, she thought, catching her breath. I've got to get out of the house.
Entry 084.
That's a church. That's a drunk guy. That's a donut shop. Those are pigeons. That's a school. That's a statue of, I don't know, probably a soldier or a general or something. That's a cop. That's a flower. That's a bag.
That's a trash
That's an
can.
That's an accident.
That's
That's
a
an angry
stoplight.
person.
Those are people
yelling.
in line.
Those are
mannequins.
That's a
Dog.
happy baby.
That's a woman
That's Aretha
singing in her
Franklin. That's a
car.
park. I mean the song.
That's
not
the
the
sun
woman. That's a
going
pond.
down.
That's a kid on
That's
a
an
bike.
old man. That's an old
Those are
woman.
pinatas.
That's a family. That's a
That's a
cloud.
plane. That's a star.
Or
That's
a
that's the
plane.
wind. That's a door.
Entry 106.
Is it illegal? Prompted Jan as she sat back down. The waiter had dropped their coffees off with zero fanfare and rushed to his smoke break. So when Jan saw that there was no sugar at the table, she had gone a-hunting and come back with a fistful of white paper packets. She used 4 in her cup, then vengefully began jamming the remainder into the empty dispenser. Well, no, not exactly. I mean, it's First Amendment stuff, Ida said, hedging. It's not illegal to write code. It's illegal to build bombs. Aims aren't bombs, meaning that they can be dangerous. So can people. Should we stop having kids? That killed the conversation for a few minutes. Ida watched the lights of the highway, stewing. There was a time when she and Jan would have talked about the underground with a sense of conspiratorial excitement, but her sister's attitude now was more like parental condescension. It was so much different when they were young. In fact, as their mother's hospital stays lasted longer and longer, Jan had become the great, bold icon of badassery in Ida's life. She handled both the adult stuff, all the medical crap, the psychologists and neurologists, and ultimately, the funeral arrangements, as well as taking on the classic big sisterly duties of introducing Ida to good music, smart books, bad beer, and driving too fast with the nonsense off. Jan had all the answers back then, or so Ida thought. In reality, though, Jan had already been through the phase of trusting their mother, and she was done with it. She didn't want Ida to be hurt like she had been. The cycle had only gotten worse. Mom would be manic and happy, repainting the house, dancing, whatever. Then something would inevitably snap, and the paranoia would kick in, the ranting, the screaming, and accusations, followed by an equally swift pivot to the soft, apologetic, needy phase, desperate to bridge the rifts she had torn open, making grand gestures, etc. Rinse, repeat. Jan could already see that Ida would do anything to please their mother, unconsciously trying to make Mom happy to make herself safe, and Jan wanted nothing more than to pull her from that busted merry-go-round. So, while their mother lived, Jan was exciting, enthusiastic, daring, and wild. But after she died, Jan had nothing to run from anymore, and in the 10 years since the funeral, she slowly, inexorably became an artificial version of herself and of motherhood, at least concerning her sister. For Ida, watching this person she loved slowly don a false front and bury her passions was terrifying. But was it false? Or was this dowdy realtor the actual one, and her hero the fake? Ida couldn't tell. She doubted if Jan knew either. I wanted to see you because Frank and I are worried about you, and I'm trying to figure out if you're getting into more trouble than you can handle. Ida sighed. Yeah, well, I'm a big girl now. I'm smart enough to handle trouble. We know how smart you are. But the problem with being smart is that you outsmart yourself better than anyone. That's a Frank line. You should do your own material. It drove Ida crazy to hear his banal cleverness in Jan's voice, but it happened more and more, as if Jan and her husband were merging into a single, play-it-safe high school counselor. It doesn't matter who said it if it's true. You can both relax then, Ida said, mixing more butter into her grits. The underground just needs someone to raise them. But Jan's response was blank, irritated. Raise them? They're not children, Ida. They're programs. Well, the programs might have a different opinion on that. Forgive me if I think you have to be awake to have an opinion. It doesn't seem to cause you any problems. Got it. Jan pointed her thumb at herself, smiling angrily. Not awake, Right. I forgot it was only you and your culty friends that see the light, she said, waving her hands in mock ecstasy. Ida tried a different tack. But you've read Anima Farm, Ida offered. So? She bit her lip, pushing the anger down. The book had changed Ida's life, and it was how Macias's original aim announced itself to the world. The first issue humanity faced from a real artificial mind wasn't annihilation or global domination. It was a novel. Only 200 pages long, but it had apparently been written in about 6 minutes. And this, it turned out, was far more upsetting to people than if it had taken over the nuclear codes. It took Congress less than a week to illegalize what Macias had done, outlaw the creation of any further aims, and halt the publication of the book. What do you mean, so? You said it was beautiful. It was. Well, an AIM wrote it. How can you say that it's not conscious if it made you feel something like that? A sunset might be beautiful, but no one makes that either. It's just physics, pollution, and sunlight. The beauty part comes from me, Ida, from my mind. I mean, sure, I think it's incredibly clever that a machine could write a book, but that doesn't mean it's awake. How would you know the difference? How can you tell if I'm awake or not? I guess I just believe in you, she said, as if she didn't.
Entry 111.
The Waffle House was nearly empty except for a couple waiting for a tow truck. Something about them reminded Ida of her parents. A vague impression only. Ida had only known her father until she was 4.5, but the chiaroscuro cut out of their backlit, worn-out forms matched the image in her mind as much as anything might. It was when they were in love. She blinked, wrecked it.
Entry 128.
Ida became aware that she was no longer asleep, but the realization wasn't immediate, more like slipping into a tub of room-temperature water. The transition was soft, vague. Her back ached. It was the ancient couch that did it, but still she didn't move. Her body was sleep-warm, almost damp. She could feel the burlap discomfort of the cheap throw pillow under her neck, the bead of spit in the corner of her mouth. Her arm was numb. Ida sat up, shaking out her hand until it prickled and became her own again. Then she remembered the lenses and smiled. She had left them running on purpose. Another dream. But this one she couldn't remember.
Entry 207.
Ida did not witness her mother die, nor see her dead at any point. Jan had identified the body alone, and by the service, she was already ash. So even though Ida snuck into the living room one night and cracked the pewter lid to feel the dry gray kernels of her mother's bones between her fingers, it was difficult to believe in it deeply, to have faith in her death. It remained conceptual for Ida, as if her mother was still out there, floating in the ozone, like Mike TV in Willy Wonka. Her sister once told her that for a while after the funeral, Ida would talk to Mom as if she was still in the house. It went on for weeks, she said, and it worried Jan. Ida remembered nothing of it until this moment, standing atop the cement lip at the edge of the building. This was where my mom jumped from. She looked down. The street was plain, cracked. No shops or offices, just corrugated garage doors, back entrances. It was no one's destination, just a place between places. No wonder it was many hours before her body had been found. Ida had been narrating the journey to the lenses all the way here, but now she couldn't think of anything more to say. She felt like she should feel more. She suspected that maybe she did, but it was 1,000 miles beneath her heart, churning like the mantle of the earth. The blankness of the place only reinforced this. On a whim, she selected the options in her drop-down. Everything was grayed out, except a trial veneer called Fat Tuesday. She blinked it, and immediately the bright sound of trumpets blared from around a corner below. They kept a buoyant, lively beat, playing When the Saints Go Marching In. Color and texture bled outward from the sound, patterns peeling over the neutral walls and alleys as they were remapped with the texture of rain-stained brick and flaking white paint. Balconies sprouted from the sides of buildings, populating themselves with waving bells and hyper-saturated dresses, each standing with a handsome man in an equally colorful suit. The band appeared and turned onto the main avenue, stomping and swaying with vividly reflective golden horns, flashing cymbals, puddles sparkling beneath highly polished shoes. Revelers bloomed to reality in a V-shaped wave to either side, like the wake of a boat. Looking at them, Ida watched the resolution increase on their smiling faces, details refining as they basked in her attention, then blurring when she looked away, devolving into only suggestions of lives. The newborn crowd sang along drunkenly, then suddenly exploded with cheers as a coffin rounded the corner carried by serious-looking men. Then the band leader looked to Ida, doffed his elaborate top hat, and led the players out of town. They faded away as a blanket fell over the soundscape, purchase options springing up before her. Ida blinked it off. She felt unsettled. She believed in Ames being awake, but where was the line? Did those figures in that faux New Orleans have a life of their own in any sense, however brief? Did they feel things more intensely when Ida looked at them, only to have those feelings muted when she looked away? Cursed to be born into a world where God was a malignant narcissist, granting them full reality only when she gazed upon them. Ida imagined the band leader and his crew turning the corner out of sight, lowering their trumpets and dropping their smiles, letting the performance go, wanting bitterly to tell her, "Don't you get it? Don't you understand? This is supposed to work both ways. We may only exist because of you, but you only exist because of us. What would you be without all the devotion, all the prayers, all the aves, all the miserable singing, all the sacrifice? Nothing. You think all of this is because you deserve it? It's a two-way street. We make each other real." She found herself on the edge, having unconsciously sat down as her thoughts roamed. The structure was an automated garage, a blandly brutal pile of concrete with no human access points at all, save for the emergency ladder that Ida had climbed. An architectural afterthought. There was no security, no way to steal the cars themselves. They were all nonsense, parked within a centimeter of each other, and most had no driver's seat to start with. She sat for a few moments more, feeling the damp breeze, and for a second she thought she heard the band still playing. But it was only Muzak piped out into the village courtyard of the mall that fronted this place. Had her mother heard the same thing? Did she wonder, like Ida did, if anyone from that facade town would find her back here in this dead gray maze? Ida looked down. 100 feet was plenty of time for a mind to say, "No, wait." The idea terrified her. It was a hell of a fall. But she knew this already. Cremation had been recommended due to the catastrophic damage that her mother's body had suffered. Ida had overheard the funeral director use this phrase as he spoke on his cell to some unknown authority. Catastrophic damage. Like she was Humpty Dumpty, no putting her back together again. The director couldn't have known their mother was broken to begin with, and because of this, she only knew Ida in pieces as well. When other kids heard that Ida's mother was schizophrenic, they assumed it meant she had multiple personalities. This was largely due to movies. Some of her mom's favorites, in fact, like Hitchcock's Psycho or The Three Faces of Eve, or Sybil, a TV movie from the 1970s with which Mom had been obsessed. It was about a woman with 16 different personalities, all of whom her mind had created to protect her from the memories of horrific abuse. She tried to watch that one. Mom had promised her it had a happy ending, had wanted her to see it because of that, in fact. But Ida couldn't finish it. It scared her worse than Psycho had. These movies had nothing to do with the reality of schizophrenia, of course. Not that that mattered to Hollywood. A good plot twist was a good plot twist. But the truth was that while Ida's mother did suffer from multiple personalities, they weren't her own, they were everyone else's. For Jan, the nice one, The mean one. For Ida. The smart one that made Mom so proud. The bad one who would never live up to her potential. The sweet one that was the only one who listened. And the nothing who didn't exist at all. But while all of these versions of Ida lived in her mother's head, they never cohered into a full person for her. At least not before the egg shattered. It was getting cold, but she stayed to watch the sun sink down through the billboard forest that loomed behind the shopping center. It was beautiful. Shreds of pink streaked over furrowed orange clouds, the lights of Atlanta strung beneath them, spikes of blinking radio towers poking up defiantly below. Maybe Jan was right. Maybe the beauty came only from Ida's mind. But just because that was Ida's experience didn't mean it was the only experience to be had. Even if the world was the solipsistic nightmare of Fat Tuesday, wasn't that sunset still awake in some way? At minimum, it was some inaccessible area of Ida's own brain, a little glob of cells all standing in revolt and demanding that Ida understand one thing. I am a sunset! I am a sunset! I am a sunset! Ida had no choice but to believe them. Wasn't that valid enough? Wasn't that identity? Or was it just another kind of cascade failure? And then the sun was gone.
Entry 230.
This lady changed my life. Ida held the picture up before the lenses for a few seconds. It was an image of a dead woman. Julieta Macias, mother of the underground. She wrote your base code. Ida snorted as she swirled her plastic cup of tequila. Hell, she basically wrote my base code. She was a little wobbly, a little angry. They killed her when she was 83. 15 years before Ida was born. Ida had first heard of her when Jan gave her a copy of Macias's El Fantasma en la Maquina. Though Jan knew nothing about coding or AI, it was obvious that Ida was a seed waiting to be watered, and Mom was never going to do it. But Jan must have known something about Macias. The woman's work had achieved an Einsteinian level of fame before she began to design the first AIM, and her fight with the government over the rights of non-corporeals was legendary. El Fantasma was written from prison, making the title painfully ironic. Part of Jan must have wanted to stir up some kind of revolutionary ideas in Ida. Why did she fight her so hard on it now? Ida held the photo in one hand and toasted it with the other. You were an old woman. Then she knocked the drink back, savoring the fire on her tongue. And you still scared the hell out of them. Tears stung the corners of her eyes. Irritated, she wiped her cheeks with her wrist, feeling suddenly ridiculous and booze-maudlin. She put the picture back on the refrigerator door, still staring at it. Black and white, stark, like a film noir. Macias's body had fallen half out of the car. To one side, her husband was kneeling in confused shock. The killers had hacked the vehicle's core, hit the brakes, and locked the doors as it made its turn. Another car squealed to a stop next to them, and 4 men got out carrying machine guns. They took their time getting into position. There were shouts, but no one stopped them as they fired into the vehicle. Macias had died instantly. The rounds were high velocity, puncturing the normally unbreakable glass of the windscreen and plunging into Julieta's heart. Raul Macias survived, but was trapped inside with his dead wife for 20 minutes while a code team negotiated with the car to open its doors. When it finally unlocked, Julieta spilled out onto the ground to the horror of the gasping crowd. That was the moment the photo was taken. Ida poured another. Goddamn, Jan was never going to call back anyway.
Entry 251.
Not yet, but soon. There will be more of you than leaves in a forest, than rabbits in a warren, than drops in a stream. Until then, be and become.
Entry 303.
The music was blasting. Ida could turn it down. It was only being broadcast to their earbuds, but it felt good to get lost in it, to step away from the constant scrolling of her thoughts. When she first showed up, the scene looked silly, in the way that raves always did when she wasn't on their wavelength. A clot of people hopping around, swept up in dervish-like fervor with their shoes scuffing and clacking in an awkward library silence that was broken only by the occasional hoot or pointlessly screamed conversation at the bar. But it was even stranger now, as this was outdoors, virtually the woods, the neighborhood was so decomposed, and in the moonlight and cross-hatched shadows, the party took on a distinctly pagan vibe. The place was called No Exit. Ida rolled her eyes a bit at the name's hokey self-importance. Cool to be cool, like most people here, she thought. Then Jan Aim interrupted. Judge Ida, huh? You only get this way when you're self-conscious, you know. Stop being such a bitch. You stop, she snapped back, catching herself mouthing the words, instantly embarrassed that others probably saw this. She walked ahead, looking around to escape her thoughts. The place was built around the ruin of an abandoned interchange. Tipped arcs of concrete left to crumble in a riot of chickweed and brome, as the new driverless highway lay unfinished another 4 miles away. People were dancing and drinking, but this was a codehead bash, so there was nearly as much talk. She scanned the topics from her drop-down. The high-level groupings were always generalized. If Ida were in a mall, the selections would have been sports, politics, best beer, etc. But here it was already deep into specifics. AIM, euthanasia, 3 conversations, pre-realization concept ownership, 2, ethics of politically inflected seed variations, 7, and about 20 scattered others, the descriptors flickering as the conversations flowed into new territory. She blinked on concept ownership, and a pulsing zigzag arrow leapt up from the earth and shot over to the group, leaving a dotted trail for Ida to follow. She blinked it off. She didn't feel like dealing with anyone face to face. Of course, no one wore their actual faces tonight. The underground took over the lens channel and wrote over people's identities automatically. It was for security. While they tried to play it off as hip, it was not optional. The default was Marlon Blando, a joke no one here got. It was a doughy, indistinct non-face that Ida found a little disturbing, especially in groups. So she switched over to what the iDJ was spinning. The Blandos were instantly swapped out with neon horse heads, pulsing violet and phosphorescent lime, their demon eyes and light bulb teeth leaving glow trails that dissolved into shimmering peels of text. A mix of English and maybe Farsi? The English she recognized as lyrics to the track that was battering the porches of her ears. She should have been happy to be getting out of the house now that the holistics were stabilized and waiting. But instead, she was just frustrated. It was the waiting that was killing her. The egg sat like a bomb on her desk. And more than a few times now, she had woken with a jolt, dreaming that goons in beetle-black armor were smashing through the front door, pinning her to the wall with glue guns as they tore her equipment apart and carried the creche out like a football. For months, all she wanted to do was get out of that damned apartment, if only to get away from those nightmares. But now that she was the anonymous guest of honor at this acid trip baby shower, all she wanted was to get home to her worn-out couch. Christ, was she ever comfortable anywhere? She dutifully joined a line that terminated in a splintered picnic table stacked with coolers, the bungholes of each dispensing multicolored liquor. Something in it reacted to the blacklight strobes. Great, barium coladas. She filled a cup and went into lurker mode, wandering, listening to the party like a podcast, a horse-headed wallflower. She wrecked it. This is a party. It's for you, actually, she whispered. So, happy birthday. She cheers to nobody. Oh my God, are you her? Ida looked up. The other horsehead had the body of a high school girl, skinny and a bit knock-kneed. Ida was confused for a moment, but before she could apologize, a howling wave roared from the dancing crowd as the iDJ sent new designs to everyone's lenses. The girl's mask dissolved into a fractal tornado, colors skewing red. She laughed, pointed at Ida.
Now you're Julieta Macias!
That's so dry, she clapped, loving it, her own face resolving into an image of Julieta's as well. Dry? Was that good? Ida couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years older than her, but suddenly she felt like an old woman. The girl looked around.
I can't tell who the guys are supposed to be, though.
Ida peeked around the corner, black berets, robust beards. They're Che Guevara.
Che who?
Ida would have answered, but the girl wasn't really listening. She was swept up, watching the dancers go crazy. Some of the men had discovered that if they positioned their arms the right way, an AK-47 appeared and they could shoot the sky just by shaking their hands. Neon bullets fountained upward, blooming into more overproduced fireworks. She could only imagine how stupid all this looked without lenses. But the girl was mesmerized. This was her world. Finally, she turned back to Ida.
Anyway, I heard you talking. You're her, aren't you? Jesus, you're like my hero.
Ida raised her hand. Listen, don't say,
Oh no, woman. Nothing. I've got you.
I'm just, wow, you know?
So what are you gonna name it?
Hobbs, I think.
Really?
She looked surprised.
I would have figured someone like you would be crazy anti-Hobbs.
What?
Hobbs! I mean, I'm sure Leviathan is genius and whatever, but he argued for monarchy, right? Like total top-down government? Unless you mean like the sovereignty of the mind over the other parts of the brain. You mean like that?
Ida had no idea who she was talking about.
No, I meant the tiger.
The Julieta mirror looked back at her, equally perplexed. The old comic? Ida offered. The kid and the tiger?
Oh, yeah,
she smiled. It seemed like years of embarrassed dead air after that. Wait, Ida thought, suddenly defensive. How could this girl know who that Hobbs was and not know Che Guevara?
Oh, leave her alone, she heard Jan's voice say. You only know Che from the t-shirt. You're no different.
The girl mercy-killed the silence.
Hey, I'm gonna go dance! But thanks, for everything.
She waved and left. Ida thought she heard the hidden disappointment in her voice, and it burned. The girl was probably expecting some sort of priestess, some sort of oracle who had spoken directly with these new gods, and instead she got Ida. She sighed, drank. Some oracle.
Entry 332.
Ida sat against the washing machine, feeling its warm, womb-like thrum. She breathed in the smell of cheap detergent and stale clothing, felt the cracked linoleum floor beneath her, let it belie her true situation. For a moment, living in two worlds. The textures and scents told her she was in the Laundrodome, but as far as her lenses were concerned, she was in a darkened movie theater, lush with velvets and dim red lights. As the project came to a close, she decided to watch one last picture to see what kind of happy ending her mother had been talking about. Sybil. The theater was a fancy place. To either side of the proscenium, cream-colored pillars of mixed design were wrapped in outscale coils of movie film, the frames of which were playing living sculptures of famous sequences as they reached upward, supporting a ceiling that was painted with a night sky. Here, stars and strips of languidly moving cloud were crossed by dueling pastel searchlights, the edge of the plaster dome ringed by a trompe-l'oeil railing, upon which leaned a collection of stars of another kind, animating dreamily, most of whom she couldn't name. These were her mom's real imaginary friends. Grace Kelly, maybe? Amir Khan. The obligatory black-and-white Bogart. Other handsome ones like him. Marcello Mastroianni, cool as hell. Brad Pitt. And, what's his name? From Repo Man. She couldn't remember. Estevez, yes. Denzel Washington, Mariko Okada, Helen Mirren. Peter Sellers, also desaturated, standing up from his wheelchair to look down at her. And, I'll be damned, she thought. Ida Lupino. She was touched momentarily by the coincidence, but then remembered she bought this setting through her personal account. The environments company would have scanned her background, seen any time she had texted the story of her name to a friend, for instance, and used that to tailor the model. Somewhere out there, they had made a sim, an Ida-flavored AI that companies could consult, asking what the real Ida would like. It became more accurate with every interaction, every purchase, every comment she made online. Ida hated when she agreed with Sim Ida, but Sim Ida knew that too, and sometimes she would intentionally get her predictions wrong in deference to the original to make her feel more comfortable. Which was this? If Lupino knew, she wasn't saying. She just looked down at her with an impossibly broad smile. That's showbiz, kiddo. Predictable or not, Ida's feelings were still valid. She felt them. She might as well be mad at movies for being fake. People went to the movies to have their emotions played with. Wasn't that the point? It was only when they were too obvious about it that the manipulation offended us. The only place those screen characters truly existed was in our minds, she thought. But a mind was a real place, wasn't it? And certainly it was the only place where these characters' actions were unpredictable to both us and them. The cluster of cells in Ida's brain who only knew itself as Sybil didn't know what the next line was, and neither did Ida. In a technological sense, the characters were simply maps of light and shade, hypnotizing the crowd into thinking that their shadow forms were more real than the people watching them, like Plato's allegorical cave dwellers. But if a crowd believed it, if they forgot themselves and invested emotional identity into Rick or Godzilla or Igor or Deckard or Sybil or Jack, wasn't there some level of consciousness for that character? Weren't they aspects of ourselves, parts of our mind that were beyond our control? The Jan in Ida's mind thought it was Jan. Weren't we all a sort of Russian doll of each other's realities, worlds within each other's worlds, worlds within our own? Or was it all like the holistics in the egg, thinking they were awake, but in reality just following the seed variations like a script, and believing they were having original thoughts? Was there still a realization waiting for us somehow? In either case, it made Ida feel good to think that she wasn't the boundary of these characters' lives, that her brain was simply the hardware on which the program ran, a timeshare with other identities. That in some way, her consciousness was transferred to the screen, able to look back at the Ida in the audience, leave her there, and walk off into another, secret world that existed beyond. Somewhere unattached to her history, her mistakes, free and new. Then again, maybe that's what her mother thought. She looked around. There were too many people here. The theater came preloaded with a noisy crowd that would ooh and awe to every emotional beat. For a while, it was fun, but she was starting to feel cornered. She blinked, looked for the population slider, and turned it down to just a few scattered folks here and there. That was better. Mom may have preferred a full house, but Ida just didn't want to be alone. If she wanted to be authentic, then she should be alone, watching Sybil on her couch. It was a TV movie, not a theatrical one, but it didn't feel right. This was her mother's favorite story, and if Mom lived anywhere, it was here, not at the Perimeter Palace. She considered it. Fine, she thought, and upped the crowd's number just a bit. On screen, the final reel unspooled. Sally Field, the actor playing Sybil, was being introduced to her alternate selves. Each was played by someone different, and in this semi-dream sequence they all became one, merging as Sybil was healed. Ida didn't say anything, though she couldn't help but smirk. It was sort of ridiculous. Sure, the story had its moments, but overall, it was some seriously cornball material, nothing like the horror show she remembered from being young. And, to read the user comments, supposedly the whole thing was a fiction anyway, a con job ginned up to sell books. Barely any truth at all in this true story. But this kind of unity, the closure you only get in the movies, Mom would have loved that all right. It was something she both wanted with every cell in her body and fought every second of her life. Ida felt hot tears on her face. She missed her. Every version did.
Entry 360.
She stopped, breath rasping in her throat. Breathe. Breathe. Looking down, she estimated it was about 7 seconds of free fall to the muddy field below. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she involuntarily tightened her grip, feeling a faint vibration through her fingers as the slightest breeze strummed the tower. Ida felt like she was tied to the tip of a ticking metronome. She sat down on a crossbar and looked out at the city. This is where you will be born, Ida thought. And then she said it out loud. That was it. Rollout. The end. Ida's lenses cleared, presenting her with a strange dissolve, the final frame of the seed variations fading to the exact same perspective of the real world. Atlanta, now brighter, its glow merging with the light that gathered on the horizon beyond. Her legs were wet, numb with rain. She slapped at them to get the blood flowing. The storm was over, but the climb wasn't. She could already hear Manny impatiently getting ready above. "Almost set," she called up to him as she tapped the last key code in. The egg hummed, out of her control. The last baffles between the holistics were now being dissolved, each knitting to each as they thawed, swirling into one another, inevitably forming a whole. If anything were to go wrong, it would happen now. But then, just like that, the light turned green. The data had begun flowing into the network. Only a minute or two, and it would be over. She couldn't believe it. Ida sat for a second, stunned by the anticlimax. She shook her head, sighed. Come on, what did you expect? Be happy it's working, and move on. Pull yourself together. She reached to take the electrodes off, but stopped. She wanted to step down, but found herself frozen, a claustrophobic envelope pulling in around her as she watched the data bar slowly disappearing, like a fuse. No, wait! Ida felt like she was falling. She couldn't do this. She couldn't. The feeling was sudden and shockingly strong. She couldn't do it. She grabbed the egg. It was too late. Too late. No stopping it now. Everything all right? Manny said. I'm good. But she wasn't. She was scared, hearing her voice break as emotion punched up inside her. Hyperstimulated, electric, desperate. She clamped down on it, surprised at her own anger, her resistance. The world felt slippery, shining too brightly. The sun and the city blurring together, the tower spinning. Sounds in her ears. Jan's voice. Mom's. Her mind melting between them. She wanted to scream. Was it a panic attack? With the electrodes on, all of this was still being sent to the remaining data in the egg. She had to take them off. She had to stop it, or all this fear would be embedded into the aim as well. But she couldn't move, couldn't let go. It was impossible to let go. Of all this work, all these moments, everything sliding free from her heart, slipping away from her. But there she was, going onward, expanding, becoming separate, falling away into the unknown, becoming infinite, becoming real. Out into the woods with the other rabbits, out into the woods. Her lungs burned. Her heart was breaking inside her chest like a cell in division. Her veins filled with hot regret, hopeful joy, love, sadness, anger, freedom, all scouring her from the inside out, animating her, kicking her in the stomach, sobbing, bursting to yell, to holler at the world these first thoughts, these last rhyming thoughts they would share together. I am your sister. I am your mother. I am your daughter. I am your hero. I am a sunrise. I am a sunrise. I am a sunrise. Who are you?
This text, in its original form, is available on Amazon Kindle as The Sybil and the Skin Horse. For more stories and films, please like and subscribe to this channel. All work copyright 2018 and 2023, Daniel Thron. Voices created with 11 Labs speech synthesis, music, Electron, available from Soundful AI.